They ordered retreat. But the Queen stayed, because a human soldier wouldn't let her child die. The retreat order came at 0347 local time, broadcast on the encrypted command channel in the flat, unhurried voice of General Commodore Vethsaran, the kind of voice that had given such orders before and had learned not to apologize for them. Sergeant First Class Marcus Dellin heard it through his earpiece while crouched behind a collapsed support column on the third sublevel of the Kethra Administrative Citadel. Around him, the air smelled of scorched mineral composite and something older, something biological that he'd learned to associate with Vashti blood. The corridor lights had failed 6 minutes ago. He was operating on the green wash of his tactical visor, watching the thermal signatures of his 4 remaining squad members through the debris. All coalition elements, this is command actual. Effective immediately, operation holding pattern is suspended. You are ordered to withdraw to extraction points Delta through Foxtrot. Acknowledge. The channel crackled with acknowledgements. Unit designations rattling off in sequence. Marcus didn't respond yet. He turned his head slowly and looked through a broken archway into the chamber beyond. It was a large space, maybe 40 meters across, with a vaulted ceiling that the architects had designed to impress. The Vashti built everything to impress. Their aesthetic was vertical, everything reaching upward, everything suggesting ascension. Right now the chamber held something that made the architecture irrelevant. The Vashti Queen, Matriarch Thesavir, if the intelligence briefings were accurate, was pressed into the far corner with her back against the wall. She was larger than any Vashti Marcus had encountered in the field, her exoskeletal plating a deep iridescent blue that caught the distant light of fires through a high window. She was injured. He could see the trauma clearly. Her left primary limb was held close to her body at a wrong angle, and the pale luminescent fluid that served Vashti biology as blood had dried in long trails from her thorax. She was not looking at Marcus. She was looking down. Pressed against her, nearly hidden beneath her secondary limbs, was a juvenile Vashti. Small enough that Marcus's mind kept trying to call it something diminutive, something with the grammar of infancy built into it. The juvenile was making a sound, not a cry exactly, more like a sustained vibration, a frequency below speech. He'd never heard it before. He suspected very few humans had. He suspected it meant something close to please. Dellin. That was Corporal Amara Voss, crouching 2 meters to his left, her voice as flat as she could make it. You heard the order. I heard it. Then we're moving. He didn't move. He'd been a soldier for 11 years. He'd been deployed in 4 separate theater conflicts, 2 of which had involved the Vashti hegemony before the tentative coalition accords had reclassified the relationship. He had a professional's relationship with orders. You followed them because the chain of command existed for reasons that transcended any individual's moral arithmetic, and the math of a battlefield was too chaotic and too lethal to be solved by one sergeant's conscience in real time. He knew all of this. He believed it mostly. But the juvenile Vashti was vibrating that sound, please, and the Queen was watching him with 4 compound eyes that, for all their alienness, managed to communicate something that Marcus recognized without translation. Don't. Not a threat. Not a warning. A request. An appeal. The same thing a mother in any species communicated when something threatened her child and she had already calculated that she could not stop it. Dellin, Voss said again. We have 4 minutes before the demolition charges on the upper levels go off. That's not a metaphor. We need to move. Yeah, he said. He didn't move. I know. He looked at the Queen. She was watching him with that stillness that the Vashti deployed when they were conserving energy for what came next, the biological equivalent of a held breath. Her injured limb twitched once and she suppressed it. The juvenile buried itself deeper into her secondary limbs and the vibration changed pitch. Marcus pressed the transmit key on his comm unit. Command, this is Sergeant Dellin, 4th Coalition Infantry, designation Dellin 7 Actual. I'm acknowledging the withdrawal order. I am also reporting a developing situation at my current position that I believe requires command-level attention before I can comply. Pause. Then a different voice, not Vethsaran, someone from the coordination staff. Dellin 7, state your situation. He thought about how to say it. I have eyes on Matriarch Thesavir, he said. She's wounded and stationary. She has a juvenile with her. Pause. The juvenile appears to be in medical distress. The channel went quiet for 6 full seconds. Then, Dellin 7, your orders are unchanged. Withdraw to extraction point Echo. Understood, Marcus said. Request clarification. Does command want me to engage the matriarch before withdrawal, or leave her in place? Another pause longer. Leave her in place, Sergeant. She's not your problem. He took the earpiece out and set it carefully on the debris beside him as if he might need it later. Sir, Voss said. Her voice had changed now, less flat, more careful. The voice she used when she was calculating rather than protesting. What are you doing? Marcus looked at the juvenile Vashti again. It was smaller than his niece's dog. It was pressed against its mother like it was trying to become part of her body. It was making a sound that crossed approximately 60 million years of divergent evolution and still landed in his chest as something he recognized. He stood up. He kept his hands visible. He walked into the chamber. He'd done hostile contact protocols 100 times in training and a dozen times in the field. The Vashti weren't signatories to any standard engagement accord. Their biology made handshakes impossible and their communication relied on pheromonal and subsonic channels that humans couldn't produce. What the coalition called peaceful contact with a Vashti individual was mostly about not dying in the first 30 seconds. Marcus walked slowly. He kept his rifle slung across his back, muzzle down, both hands open at his sides. He stopped 10 meters from the queen and crouched, not kneeling, which Vashti read as submission and therefore weakness, but a low squat that put his eye line below hers while keeping his weight on his feet. She watched him. Her 4 compound eyes didn't converge on a single point the way human eyes did. They were positioned for wide-field awareness rather than focal depth. But he'd learned, in the years of intermittent coalition interactions, that Vashti indicated attentiveness by a slight rotation of the cranial plate. She rotated toward him. He kept his hands open. Behind him, he heard Voss say something in a low voice, a curse probably or a prayer. With Amara they were sometimes the same thing, and then heard her boots on the debris as she followed him in. The other 3 members of the squad would be watching the corridor. He trusted them to do that much. The queen made a sound. Not the juvenile's pleas, something deeper, a resonance he felt in his sternum. A challenge maybe. Or an identification. I am Thesavir. Who are you that walks toward me with empty hands? Marcus put his right fist over his chest. A gesture he'd seen Vashti use with each other, meaning roughly I am here, I acknowledge you. The gesture was in one of the coalition cultural briefs that most soldiers never read. He'd read it because he was constitutionally unable to not read things. The queen went still. He pointed at the juvenile. Then he made a gesture with 2 fingers, pointed outward, spreading, that the brief had described as the Vashti symbol for assessment, for examination, for let me see what I am dealing with. The queen made the same sound again but shorter this time. Less challenge. More question. He tapped his chest, pointed to the juvenile, then made the universal gesture for small with his flattened hand, low to the ground, measuring nothing. He was aware this was probably useless. Gesture-based communication with a species that communicated chemically and subsonically was not going to produce understanding through mime. But sometimes the gesture wasn't the communication. Sometimes what communicated was the act of trying. The queen watched him for 3 full seconds. Then, slowly she shifted her secondary limbs. The juvenile came into view. Marcus had seen Vashti juveniles in intelligence files, grainy photographs and thermal scans mostly. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of one this close. It was perhaps 30 centimeters long, still translucent in the way of things that hadn't quite finished being made, its exoskeletal plates still soft at the margins. Its limbs moved with the uncoordinated trembling of something not yet in full command of itself. It was also clearly injured. Even without any training in Vashti medicine, and he had approximately none, Marcus could see the deformation in its thoracic segment. Something had compressed the exterior plates. Blunt force, probably from the structural collapse that had brought several of the Citadel's upper levels down 3 hours ago. He reached slowly for the medkit on his thigh. The queen made a sharp sound, a spike of resonance that cut through the chamber and rattled something loose from the ceiling. A warning. Don't. Marcus stopped. Kept his hands where she could see them. Showed her the medkit, an orange case the size of a thick paperback book, standard coalition infantry issue. He opened it with one hand and turned it so she could see the interior. Bandages, sealant tabs, a dermal scanner, auto-injectors. She looked at it. He pointed at the scanner. Slowly removed it from the kit. Held it out toward the juvenile at arm's length, not reaching for the juvenile, just showing her the tool. The scanner was designed for human physiology. It would tell him almost nothing useful about a Vashti juvenile. But the queen didn't know that, and he didn't need it to work on the juvenile. He needed her to understand that the object in his hand was diagnostic, not threatening. Tool. Not weapon. She watched the scanner for a long moment. Then she moved her secondary limbs again, fully exposing the juvenile. Okay, Marcus said quietly, more to himself than anyone. Okay. He moved forward on his knees. Slowly. Everything slowly. Behind him, Voss had taken up a position at the archway. She wasn't pointing her weapon at the queen. She was watching the corridor. He registered this without turning, the small sound of someone making a decision to trust the situation their sergeant had created. He reached the juvenile. It made a sound higher pitched than the please frequency, something more immediate, more frightened. Marcus stopped. The queen's injured limb shifted, not toward him, not threatening him, but the motion of a creature physically restraining itself from an impulse. I know, he said. To the juvenile. To the queen. To the general absurdity of the situation. I know. I'm going to be quick. He ran the scanner across the juvenile's thoracic segment without touching it. The device beeped, displayed a human-readable graph that was entirely meaningless for Vashti biology and gave him nothing. But when he moved it slowly along the juvenile's body, he could see what he needed to see without the scanner anyway. The deformation was on the left lateral segment. One of the plates had been driven inward. He'd seen similar injuries in humans. Not exactly similar, biology was too different for exact, but the mechanism was recognizable. Compression injury. The internal damage depended on what was beneath that plate in Vashti anatomy, and he had no idea. But the plate itself was the problem. It was pressing inward. Whatever it was pressing on was why the juvenile was making the please sound. He looked at the queen. He pointed at the deformation. He made a slow pushing gesture, downward. Then he made the same gesture outward, inward, then out. He was miming the concept of I could address this if I knew how. The queen looked at the deformation. She looked at Marcus. She made a sound he didn't know. Something new. Not a challenge, not a warning. Something that sounded, even filtered through the cavern of completely different anatomy, like try. Marcus Dellin grew up in a city that sat on a flat plain in the middle of a continent that got tornadic storms in spring. His mother was an emergency dispatcher. His father drove long-haul freight. He had two sisters, one of whom was a pediatric nurse. The other ran a food truck that he ate at every time he was planetside, which wasn't often. He thought about his sister, the nurse, now. He'd called her once after a deployment and described an injury he'd seen, half asking her how the treatment had worked. She'd listened and then said carefully, Marcus, you know that what you described was the kind of thing that looks survivable until it isn't, right? The compression is the part that matters. You have to relieve the pressure. Everything else is secondary. He thought about that. The plate was pressing inward. Something was being compressed that shouldn't be compressed. He didn't need to understand Vashti physiology to understand the mechanical principle. His medkit had a tool he'd never used in the field, a prying device designed for wound debridement, for removing fragments from a wound channel without enlarging it. It was essentially a small, flat lever. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at the deformed plate on the juvenile's thoracic segment. He looked at the queen. She was watching him with an intensity that he'd stopped trying to interpret. She had allowed him this far. Whatever the limits of that permission were, he hadn't reached them. He held up the debridement lever. He positioned it near the edge of the deformed plate, not touching, just indicating. He looked at the queen. He made the gentle outward gesture again. Relieve the pressure. She watched. She made a sound. He took it as assent. He would never be able to fully justify that decision. He worked carefully. He found the margin of the depressed plate. It was still soft enough, still young enough, that the edges hadn't fully calcified. He inserted the lever with the precision that 4 hours of annual debridement training and 11 years of field medicine improvisation gave him. He applied gentle outward pressure. The juvenile screamed. It wasn't a sound that registered on any human frequency. It was below hearing, really. Something felt more than heard, but Marcus felt it in his teeth and his inner ear and somewhere further back in his nervous system than that. The queen made a sound like tearing metal. He heard Voss say Jesus from the archway. He didn't stop. He maintained the pressure, gentle, steady, outward. The plate resisted. He held. Then it shifted. Just a few millimeters. Just enough. The juvenile sound changed instantly. Not silence. Vashti weren't designed for silence, but the desperate frequency of please dropped away and was replaced by something quieter, more rhythmic. Something that sounded like breathing. Something that sounded like better. Marcus held the lever in place for another 10 seconds, then withdrew it with the same care he'd used going in. He sat back on his heels. The juvenile moved. Tentatively. One limb then another. The queen made a sound that Marcus had absolutely no cultural framework for. It wasn't in any brief he'd read. He felt it in his chest, below the sternum, in the region of himself where he kept things he didn't talk about. He put the debridement lever back in his medkit and closed it. He looked up at the Queen. She was looking at him. She had, he realized, lowered her cranial plate. Slightly. Less than 5 degrees. A gesture so minor he might have missed it. He thought about the sections on Vashti's social gesture. He thought, lowered cranial plate in proximity following an exchange of... He sat very still. Voss, he said. Still here, she said. Get on the comm, tell command we have a situation they're going to want to know about. Pause. What situation? He looked at the Queen. She looked at him. The juvenile was moving with increasing confidence under her secondary limbs, probing its own body with small experimental limbs in the way of creatures assessing whether they're intact. I think, Marcus said carefully, I think we just established the first non-hostile contact with a Vashti matriarch under combat conditions. He paused. I think she knows it too. Another pause from Voss. Sir, she said. The demolition charges. Right. He'd forgotten about those. How long? 2 minutes. Maybe less. He looked at the Queen. She couldn't understand what he'd said, but she'd read something in his body. The shift in weight, the turn of the head, the sudden tension that came with a time constraint. She made a sound. An inquiry. He pointed upward. He made a rapid expanding gesture with both hands. She understood. Whatever else crossed the gap between their biologies, explosion communicated. She stood, and Marcus understood, viscerally without translation, that matriarch Thesivir was not a small being. She was nearly 2.5 meters at her full height, and the deference he'd read as injury imposed was replaced now by a presence that filled the chamber differently. She was injured. She was also magnificent in the way that things are magnificent when they've decided to keep going. She moved toward the archway. She stopped. She looked back at Marcus. He stood up. He didn't entirely understand what was happening, but he followed her. The route Thesivir chose was not the route Marcus would have chosen. She moved through the Citadel's lower corridors with the navigational confidence of someone who had been inside this building for decades, which, he reflected, she probably had. The Kethera Citadel had been the administrative center of the Vashti hegemony's northern territories for approximately 3 centuries. The matriarch knew where the walls were thinnest, where the support structures would hold, where the hidden passages ran between the formal architecture and the service systems beneath it. She was also managing an injury that would have put a human in a hospital. Her left primary limb dragged at a wrong angle and she'd stopped trying to hold it close. The energy expenditure wasn't worth it, apparently. She moved anyway. Steadily. Without theater. The juvenile rode on her back, secured between secondary limbs, its smaller form occasionally visible as Marcus glanced up from watching their path. Voss ran point. Marcus ran behind the Queen. The other 3 members of the squad, Specialists Chin, Okafor, and Reinhold, spread out into a rear security formation, watching the corridors they were leaving behind. Nobody talked, which was the right call. The demolition charges went off at 4 minutes and 30 seconds after the order. Late, which meant something had complicated the detonation sequence. The sound was immense and structural, felt through the floor rather than heard through the air. The lights in the corridor flickered and died completely. Marcus's visor adjusted automatically. Thesivir didn't slow down. At one junction, she paused and turned to look at Marcus. She made a gesture with her functional primary limb, a directional indication, pointing left where Marcus's tablet map showed a collapsed section. She says left, Voss said flatly, her visor showing her the same collapsed section. She's been in this building longer than the collapse, Marcus said. Left. Voss went left. The section wasn't fully collapsed. There was a passage, narrow enough that Thesivir moved through it sideways, which looked both effortful and graceful in the way of large animals navigating spaces designed for smaller ones. The juvenile adjusted automatically, tucking in without being directed. On the other side, a maintenance corridor that led, after 2 minutes and 1 additional collapse to climb over, to a service exit that opened onto the Citadel's lower exterior wall. Outside air. Dawn light beginning at the horizon. The smell of smoke and the mineral tang of whatever the Citadel's construction materials became when they burned. Marcus got on the comm. Command, this is Delin 7 Actual. I have 5 coalition infantry plus 2 Vashti non-combatants at the service exit on the Citadel's northeast face. I need an extraction accommodation. How copy? Pause. Delin 7, confirm. 2 Vashti non-combatants? Confirmed. 1 is an injured adult. 1 is a juvenile in need of medical assessment. They assisted our withdrawal through the structure. I am requesting, he paused, choosing the word carefully, appropriate reception at extraction point Echo. The pause was longer this time. Copy Dellen 7. Define appropriate. No weapons visible. Medical personnel forward. A senior officer present with authority to make decisions. He watched Thesavir at the exterior wall, looking out over the burning cityscape that had once been the administrative heart of the northern hegemony. This is a situation where someone needs to be able to say yes. Another pause. Stand by, Sergeant. He stood by. Thesavir turned from the view and looked at him. She made a sound, low, resonant, longer than anything she'd said before. He didn't know what it meant. He knew it wasn't a threat. He knew it wasn't a challenge. He thought it might be something close to what comes next. I don't know, he said. But I'm going to make sure it's something. She looked at him for a long moment. The juvenile made a sound, not the please frequency. Something brighter. Something that, in the dawn light on the exterior of a burning citadel, sounded almost like curiosity. Almost like okay. General Commodore Vethsaran had given the retreat order because he had 23,000 soldiers deployed across a 300-kilometer front, and the Kethra operation had achieved its tactical objectives and was beginning its attrition phase, and attrition favored the side with interior lines, which was not the coalition. He had not given the retreat order because he was indifferent to what he was leaving behind. He'd given it because the alternative was losing people at a rate that the coalition's participating member states would not sustain politically, and political sustainability was, in the final analysis, the only resource that actually mattered in a long war. He was thinking about this, and about the communication from Sergeant Dellen, which his coordination staff had flagged with 3 escalating levels of urgency, when he arrived at Extraction Point Echo in a ground vehicle that had taken 40 minutes to navigate the combat debris on the road from the command post. What he saw was this. 5 coalition infantry personnel, weapons slung, standing in a loose perimeter. A large Vashti adult sitting against a vehicle barrier, her injured limb extended, a juvenile Vashti pressed against her flank. And Sergeant First Class Marcus Dellen, crouching 3 meters from the adult Vashti, apparently engaged in a gestural exchange that the general's adjutant described in a whisper as possibly communication, sir, or possibly just both of them being very patient. Vethsaran was a Theral, one of the coalition's founding species, quadrupedal, short-furred, with a face that humans found either pleasantly cat-like or disconcerting depending on their cultural reference points. He was 63 years old and had been in military service since he was 18. He had survived 3 wars and 2 ceasefire agreements and 1 complete political reorganization of the coalition structure. He walked to Sergeant Dellen. Dellen stood and saluted with the coalition formality that the general had worked for 20 years to teach human soldiers and that they still performed with an awkward self-consciousness that he found, privately, endearing. Sergeant. General Commodore. Vethsaran looked at the matriarch. She looked at him. Her cranial plate performed the same slight downward motion that Dellen had noted earlier, and unlike Dellen, Vethsaran had extensive cross-cultural briefing and knew immediately what it meant. He went very still. Sergeant Dellen, he said carefully. Did you know what you were doing? Some of it, sir. Improvise the rest. The cranial plate. I looked it up, sir. After. I only knew what it wasn't. Vethsaran turned to look at Dellen directly. Humans were still somewhat difficult for him to read. Their faces were insufficiently hairy and too mobile, but he'd had enough years to learn the basics. He read exhaustion, determination, and a specific quality of stubbornness that he associated with soldiers who had decided to stand on a principle and were waiting for someone senior to either endorse it or court-martial them. She needs medical attention, Dellen said. So does the juvenile. I told command I needed someone present with authority to say yes. And you expect me to say yes to what, exactly? Treating them. Not detaining them. He paused. And then letting them go. Vethsaran looked at the matriarch. She had been listening, not to the words but to the interaction, reading the social dynamics with the attentiveness of someone who had spent decades navigating political hierarchies. He thought about what a Vashti matriarch, wounded and attended by coalition medical personnel, released back to her territory rather than captured, would mean. He thought about the Northern Front. He thought about 23,000 soldiers and the cost of attrition and the only resource that actually mattered in a long war. Captain Reyes, he said. His medical officer stepped forward. You have 2 Vashti patients, the general said. Do your best. It took 3 hours. Captain Reyes worked with 2 medics and a xenobiological reference system that had been built for exactly this kind of unanticipated field requirement. Not built well, perhaps, and the Vashti adaptation files were incomplete, but it was something. The juvenile's injury was, as Marcus had identified, a compression fracture of the thoracic lateral plate. What he hadn't known was that beneath that plate lay the juvenile's primary respiratory siphon, and the compression had been partially occluding it for approximately 4 hours before Marcus had cleared it. The medical team spent 40 minutes using adapted instruments to ensure the clearance was complete and the siphon undamaged. The juvenile tolerated this with what Reyes described in her report as remarkable stoicism, and Marcus would have described as absolutely terrifying stillness in something that small. Thesivir's primary limb was a complex fracture of the equivalent of a humerus, one of the thick limb segments below the thoracic junction. The xenobiological system was useful here. Vashti had been studied extensively enough that the fracture management protocols existed, if not in final form. Immobilization primarily. Composite wrapping. The Queen permitted this with the same quality of controlled stillness she'd shown throughout, watching the humans working on her with compound eyes that gave nothing away. At one point while the wrapping was being applied she made a sound. Sergeant Dellin, who had stationed himself nearby and had not been persuaded to eat, sleep or leave, said, "I think she's asking something." "What?" said Reyes. "I don't know. But she's asking." The sound repeated, directed at Marcus specifically. He crouched down to her eye level, she was seated now, which brought him almost level with her cranial plate, and looked at her. She made the sound again. Then she performed a gesture with her functional primary limb. She indicated the juvenile, who was sleeping with the completeness of the young and newly comfortable. Then she looked back at Marcus. He thought about it. He turned to his tablet and pulled up the gesture reference file. He spent 2 minutes in it, running options. "I think," he said slowly, "she's asking why." "Why what?" Reyes said. "Why any of this? Why I stayed? Why we helped?" He looked up at Thesivir. "Why I didn't just leave." A silence. Vethsaran had not gone back to the command post. He was sitting on a crate 15 meters away, drinking something from a field container and watching the proceedings with the air of a being who was recalibrating something fundamental about their operational calculus. "What's the answer?" Reyes said. Marcus thought about that for a moment. Then he looked at Thesivir. He pointed at the juvenile. He touched his own chest, the gesture he'd used at the beginning. "I am here, I acknowledge you." Then he made the gesture he'd found in the reference file. Both hands open, brought slowly toward each other. "No difference. There is no difference." The Queen looked at him for a long time. Then she made a sound. The xenobiological system, when Marcus queried it afterward, identified the closest analog in its database as a Vashti vocalization used in formal acknowledgement of significant events. The translation field offered 3 possible interpretations, hedged with uncertainty markers, caveat with the note that cross-species translation of ceremonial Vashti communication was an area of active scholarly controversy. The 3 interpretations were, "I understand, I will remember, and this changes something." The system noted that all 3 might be correct simultaneously. They released Matriarch Thesivir at dusk. No ceremony. No formal proceedings. Vethsaran had tried to get the coalition diplomatic liaison on a comm link, but the liaison was 3 time zones away and the comms were intermittent, and he had decided, as Marcus had anticipated, had gambled on, that this was a situation where someone needed to be able to say yes, and that someone was him. The Queen walked toward the perimeter under her own power, moving with the slight list of the newly immobilized arm. The juvenile rode on her back, secured in its position, occasionally making small sounds of wakefulness. At the perimeter edge she stopped. She turned and looked at Marcus. He was standing with his squad, Voss on his left and Chen and Okafor and Reinhold behind, all of them watching in the way soldiers watch things that were outside the normal register of their experience, with a quiet attention, a suspension of judgment, a willingness to not yet have decided what it meant. Thesivir looked at him for a long moment. Then she performed a gesture he hadn't seen before. Her functional primary limb extended toward him, palm flat, or what passed for a palm in a species without them, held briefly at a height equivalent to chest level for a human. He looked at the gesture reference file. He didn't find it. He looked at Vethsaran, who had come to stand nearby. The general was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've seen that once before. In an archival recording. It's very old. What does it mean?" Vethsaran watched the matriarch, who was still holding the gesture, patient as something that measured time in decades. "It's a crediting gesture," the general said. "Pre-modern. You see it in historical records, in negotiations between Vashti clans, when one party formally acknowledges a debt that cannot be quantified." He paused. "It's specifically used when the debt is owed to someone who was not expected to be capable of incurring it." Marcus looked at the Queen. He thought about what to do. He didn't have a reference for the reciprocal gesture. He doubted one had been translated. He did what he'd done at the beginning. He made a fist and placed it over his chest. I am here. I acknowledge you. Thesivir held the palm-flat gesture for one more moment. Then she turned and walked into the dusk with her juvenile, and the shadows took them and she did not look back. The formal negotiation request arrived at Coalition Command 11 days later. It came through a back channel that the Intelligence Analysis Division initially flagged as suspicious, because it was addressed directly to General Commodore Vethsaran and it used a form of Vashti diplomatic protocol that had not been employed in over 60 years. The pre-war form, the one that predated the hegemony's formal belligerence posture. The communication requested a preliminary meeting. No preconditions, no demands. Just a meeting. It was signed, in the Vashti method, with a chemical identifier that the Xenolinguistic Division's automated systems parsed and cross-referenced and then flagged with a note that it required human review, because the identifier matched no current hegemony diplomatic record. It matched an archival record. From before the wars. It matched the chemical identifier of the matriarch of the Northern Hegemony territories. Vethsaran read the communication twice. Then he called for Sergeant First Class Marcus Dellin, who was on medical leave 300 kilometers away, recovering from a compression injury to his own shoulder that he'd sustained on the climb over the collapse in the Citadel. Dellin arrived 2 days later. She wants to talk, the general said. I know, Dellin said. You knew she would. I thought she might. He looked out the window of the command post at the landscape that was beginning, slowly, the long process of being something other than a battlefield. I didn't know. He paused. The juvenile was in trouble and there was something I could do about it. The rest of it followed. Vethsaran looked at him. He thought about 23,000 soldiers and the cost of attrition and political sustainability, and the only resource that mattered in a long war. You're aware, the general said, that what you did was technically insubordination. Yes, sir. You left your earpiece on a pile of rubble. I did, sir. And you believe this justifies? No, sir. Dellin looked at him. I don't think it justifies anything. I think it was what I would have done regardless. I think the rest of this, he gestured vaguely at the communication on the general's desk, is separate from why I did it. Vethsaran was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that his species used in informal acknowledgement of something they would not be putting in any report. The diplomatic team will need a liaison, he said. Someone the matriarch has already, he paused, credited. Dellin looked at the communication on the desk. He read it, or as much of it as the translation system had rendered into standard. I'd need the full cultural briefing, he said. Not just the gesture file. Obviously. And I'd need to understand what the debt means. What she's offering and what she expects. Yes. And I'd need to be very clear with the diplomatic team that she's not. He stopped. Started again. That this came from something that happened between two individuals in a specific moment, and it's fragile, and if anyone goes into that room treating it as a victory to be exploited, it will not survive contact. Vethsaran looked at him for a long moment. Are you making conditions, Sergeant? I'm making observations, sir. Pause. Noted, the general said. Outside, the landscape continued its slow work. Somewhere to the north, the matriarch of the Northern Hegemony territories was returning to her people with a juvenile who was breathing correctly and a debt that had no prior quantification in Vashti diplomatic history. Somewhere in the rubble of the Kethra Citadel, a tactical earpiece sat on a pile of debris, its battery long dead, its last transmission the acknowledgement of an order that a sergeant had chosen to partially comply with. What remained was what always remains when one creature looks at another in a moment of extremity and chooses, against the logic of war, against the orders of command, against every calculation of cost and consequence, chooses to treat the other as something worth saving. What remained was the conversation that followed. It always starts that way. Every piece in history started that way, with one person who didn't leave when they should have, who stayed when the math said go, who looked at something small and frightened and said, I can do something about this. Marcus Dellin drove north 2 weeks later to a meeting that no one had anticipated and no one had planned, and everyone afterward agreed had changed things. He brought the gesture reference file. He brought the cultural briefing. He brought, from a habit he'd had since his first deployment, a med kit. He didn't expect to need it, but he brought it anyway. That, too, was a kind of faith.